An 8-year-old orphan was suddenly cast out of church by the very priest the whole town revered. No one expected that what the boy did next would shake the entire town and expose a truth long buried. That boy, every time I look at him, I think of Amelia's death. Sends a chill right down my spine. The woman's words hissed through clenched teeth, each syllable dripping with long-held bitterness. She didn't look Noah in the eye, but her voice was loud enough for everyone around to hear. And they heard. Some nodded. Most stayed silent. But silence meant the same. Noah didn't look back. He walked through the crowd, huddled under the church porch to escape the rain, as if they were nothing but smoke and ash. His small, thin back, shoulders trembling under an old coat, and both arms clutched tightly around a wooden box, as if it were the only piece of his life still intact. Everyone knew Noah, not because he stood out, but because he was the memory the whole town tried to forget, but couldn't. Mentioning him meant brushing up against a taboo, something people whispered behind closed doors but never dared to confront head-on. Noah was the son of Amelia, a quiet seamstress who lived alone in a small wooden house at the end of the hill. She was gentle, always polite, but always silent. She had once been the subject of town gossip for having a child with Bernard Huxley, a married man and a member of the church council. The moment word got out that she was pregnant, Bernard quietly packed up and moved away with his family. 3 years later, Amelia died from illness, leaving 5-year-old Noah alone in the old house, surrounded by rumors that never stopped. No one ever told the boy anything about his family or his past. The only things he heard were whispered judgments. After her death, he was placed in the orphanage, quiet, frail, and never once seen crying. When Noah arrived at the orphanage, he didn't speak for 2 whole weeks. The doctor said it was shock, but to the townspeople, that silence was more unsettling than any scream. The whispers about Noah only grew louder, and yet Noah simply learned to live with being seen as a stain no one dared touch. The only place he ever felt some peace was church. Every Sunday, he came to church, even if it was just him. Even when people stared, even when they whispered, he still came. That day, Father Gregory was giving a sermon on inherited sin, a concept grown-ups liked for its metaphorical depth, but to children, it just felt like being blamed for something they didn't do. Father Gregory was the town's lead priest, respected for his solemn presence and thoughtful sermons. But behind his stern eyes was a man rigid, conservative, and bent on control. His voice echoed steadily from the high wooden pulpit, drifting through the dimly lit sanctuary. Outside, the wind whispered through the window panes, but it couldn't drown him out. "We cannot choose where we come from," he said, "but we can choose to live a life of worth." And then, clack. A sharp, dry sound cut through the breathless stillness. Heads turned, faces winced. The small wooden box had slipped from Noah's hands and hit the stone floor. He quickly bent down, hands trembling as he picked it up. His breath came short, as though he'd done something terrible. Both knees touched the cold stone. His hands wrapped protectively around the box, as if terrified someone might take it. All eyes were on him, not with pity, but with suspicion, discomfort, and unease. Father Gregory stopped mid-sentence. He stepped down from the pulpit, his robe sweeping softly like a falling white curtain. "Mercy must not be mistaken for indulgence," he said, eyes locked onto Noah. "When a child brings unclear things into this sacred space, disrupting our holy service, it is no longer innocence. It is offense." No one had to ask who he meant. They knew. He took another step forward. "When you truly understand the sanctity of this place, and know your proper place within it, you may return. But for now, leave." Silence fell over the sanctuary. No one stood to object. No one turned to Noah. No one laughed either. Only the soft scrape of wooden pews shifting. And then someone muttered under their breath, "Even bastards know how to play the victim now." The air seemed to grow heavy, thick enough that Noah could barely lift his feet. He rose slowly, eyes still down. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He just walked, down the aisle, past rows of silent faces that judged without words. The church door opened. The light outside was a dull grey. Rain fell, cold and steady. Noah stepped out. No one called after him. He walked toward the orphanage. But he didn't know. This step would mark the beginning of a new chapter in his life. That night, Hope's Haven breathed only the faintest sounds, rain tapping against the warped tin roof, the wind whistling through an old wooden window that never quite shut, and the creak of bunk beds shifting under restless, half-asleep children. But in the small room at the end of the hall, everything was still. So still, it pressed down, like a held breath. Noah sat on the edge of the bed, legs swinging, the wooden box placed squarely in front of him. His eyes didn't move from it. A strip of yellow light spilled in from the hallway through the door crack, cutting across his face, half in shadow, half in glow, like the battle going on inside his mind. The box had been with him for nearly 3 years. He'd never opened it fully. He didn't know exactly what held him back. Fear, maybe, or some quiet instinct telling him to wait for the right moment. But today, after what happened at the church, after the cruel whispers, after Gregory's eyes, something had shifted. Noah took a breath. His hand rested on the lid. Then, not how he meant, the box slipped. It didn't hit hard, just enough for the lid to pop open. A worn cassette tape rolled out from the fabric-lined interior. The tape was old. The plastic case was scratched and dulled, like it had slept untouched for decades. Noah bent to pick it up, and his finger brushed the tiny play button on the side. A soft click broke the silence. And then, in the cold stillness, the voice of an old man filled the room, sudden and real, as if it had stepped through time itself. "If you're hearing this recording, then I'm gone. Noah, you are my only blood, the grandson of Charles Wren, the founder of St. Jude's Church, and if Gregory is there, then the church has been taken." Noah froze, eyes wide, fingers clutching the edge of the bed. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside, the voice on the tape sliced through the silence that had gripped his heart for years. "Gregory was the last person to leave my room that day. He knew I was dying, and he made sure your mother would never speak again." Another click, and everything went quiet again. But something had changed. Noah had changed. He bent down, hands trembling, grabbed the tape and shoved it into his jacket pocket. Without another second's thought, he ran out of the room, his footsteps soft but quick through the dark hallway, heading for the only door he trusted in that moment. Mrs. Hilda opened it before the third knock finished landing. Even in her wool nightgown and head wrap, she looked strangely alert, as if she'd been waiting for something all along. She saw Noah, the wooden box, the look in his eyes, and didn't ask a single question. She just stepped aside. He placed the box on the table, pulled the tape from his pocket. She looked at it like it was some artifact from another world. Noah's voice came out thin, shaken. I heard his voice. "Mr. Charles," he said. "I'm his grandson. And Gregory. He didn't just take the church. He had something to do with my mother's death." For a long second, Mrs. Hilda said nothing. Then her face turned pale and red. She sat down slowly, one weathered hand trembling against the table. "Charles Wren," she whispered. She looked up. In her eyes was a storm of shock, sorrow, and rage. "I remember. Your mother once brought a folder to the church. said it held inheritance papers from Charles. They refused to look. And after that, she disappeared from every file, every mention. No one ever told you because people were scared to even speak her name. Noah sat still, the wooden box in his lap. So, all this time, I wasn't carrying her shame. I was carrying her proof. Mrs. Hilda nodded slowly. Then she stood, crossed the room to an old drawer, and pulled out a small classroom recorder, the kind used to play spelling lessons. We'll make a copy of that tape. One for you, one for me. The original, I'll hide it where no one would think to look. Gregory's no priest anymore, she added. He's the man trying to bury every trace. And you, Noah, are now holding the one thing he's afraid of. No one knew that, at that exact moment, just outside Mrs. Hilda's window, a man stood in the downpour. He didn't move. He didn't record anything. He simply stood there, one hand in his coat pocket, eyes fixed and unblinking on the lit room inside. He didn't hear the words, but he saw the tape. He saw Noah's face. He saw Mrs. Hilda's eyes. And it was enough. The game had begun. Noah returned to his room just as the clock struck 3. His eyes were dry, showing no trace of sleep or fear. He stepped quietly across the cold floor, set the wooden box down beside the bed, like a quiet ritual. In his pocket, the copy of the tape still held the warmth of his hand. He gripped it tightly, like it had a heartbeat of its own, something that could change everything. Outside, the silver-grey car still sat beneath the eucalyptus tree, unmoving. The rain had grown heavier now, drumming on the windshield like a silent warning. No one at the camp knew what Noah had brought back tonight, and none of them could have guessed. From this moment on, the truth would no longer stay buried. Inside St. Jude's Church, the Monday morning service began with the solemn rhythm of footsteps, the echo of hymns, and Father Gregory's stern figure on the pulpit, arms outstretched in blessing. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Meanwhile, Mira, the young housekeeper at the church, was wiping down a statue near the apse. Her hand froze when she noticed something beneath the fresh, now dried layer of plaster. Faint letters scratched in with the tip of a nail. Not the one chosen for divine descent. Stunned, Mira's hand trembled. Her mother, Clara, had once worked at the church too, often covering late-night shifts. On dim evenings lit by oil lamps, Clara would speak again and again of sins hidden in stone. Once, she pointed to that very wall and said, "There are things that shouldn't be forgotten, Mira, even when you're told to forget." Mira had only nodded back then, too young to grasp it. But a few months later, her mother was found dead in the utility room. The report cited gas inhalation from a leaking candle fixture. No real investigation followed, and it was Gregory himself who broke the news. Mira sank onto a wooden bench, heart pounding, the air suddenly thin. She remembered Gregory's eyes that day, not frightened, not sorrowful, but cold as stone. A memory surfaced. Before she died, Clara had secretly shown Mira a handwritten document bearing the seal of Charles Wren, the church's founder. It read, "All temporary holdings of the parish shall be returned to the rightful heir, including..." But the rest had been torn off. Mira hadn't understood it at the time, only that her mother had hidden it well. Just then, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Gregory's shoes. He stopped at the doorway, watching Mira by the statue. "No need to clean that part," he said flatly. "Your job is to clean the altar, not dig around in the stonework." Mira stood still. A chill traced her spine. Gregory stepped closer. His voice dropped, sharp and cold. "One more thing. Tomorrow morning, go to the old storage room and burn the moldy files. Don't look through them. Don't ask questions." Mira stared at him. But some of those are original donation records. I've seen them. You weren't hired to remember the past, just to keep the present spotless, Gregory replied, with a faint, knowing smile. Just like your mother was. The word stabbed deep into Mira's chest. Gregory turned and walked away, but Mira didn't move. She heard his office door click shut. On impulse, she slipped toward the side hall. From the shadows, she caught fragments of a hushed conversation leaking through a barely open door. Gregory and Mrs. Celia. That girl Mira's starting to dig too deep, just like her mother did. If Hilda and that kid, Noah, are mixed up in this, we'll have to act soon. Are you sure Hilda still has it? Celia's voice was a whisper. Doesn't matter. We need to wipe out every trace. All of it. Mira held her breath. Her heart pounded. There was no doubt now. Hilda, her mother, and even the boy named Noah were tied to something Gregory desperately wanted buried. Across the orphanage grounds, Noah sat in a dusty supply room, replaying a newly copied audio tape. Hilda stepped in, carrying a worn leather-bound book. Here, I found an old list of parish wills before Gregory took over. The name Noah Wren is stamped in as heir, signed by Charles Wren himself. Noah set the recorder down. He let out a slow breath. And then, in a voice too steady for a child, he asked, "So, who altered the documents? Who forged the signature on the current will? And why was my mother hunted?" Knock, knock. The question was cut off by a knock at the door. He hadn't hidden the copy yet. Knock, knock. A second time. Noah peered through the small window. It was Mira. She rarely came to the orphanage. But this time, something had driven her. Those etched words, the memory of her mother, and above all, the moment from yesterday. She had stood at the end of the hallway as Gregory threw Noah out of the church in front of 100 watching eyes. She'd seen the wooden box roll across the floor. She'd seen the cold silence from a community she thought she knew. She stepped inside, pale, hair pinned up, fists clenched like she was holding something from shattering. "We need to talk about my mother. And Gregory. I don't think her death was an accident. And I believe he's connected to Noah, the child he cast out from the most sacred place." Noah looked to Hilda. She gave a slow nod and gently shut the door. In that old storage room, 3 people stood, 3 broken pieces of the past, slowly fitting back together. And in their hearts, there was no room left for silence. A sudden ring shattered the stillness. The phone on the wall rang. All 3 jumped. Hilda grabbed it quickly, but the voice on the other end was mechanical, distorted. "Stop digging into the past, or the living will vanish, just like the dead." The line went dead. No caller ID, no trace. No one spoke. But in that silence, the room thickened with dread. Their eyes met, not with suspicion, but with a shared, chilling certainty. They were being watched. Mira tightened her fists, her voice hoarse. "We're not the only ones who know about the tape." Noah swallowed hard, his gaze drifting to the curtained window. "They're listening to us." Hilda exhaled slowly. Her eyes were sharper now, steel behind the calm. "And they might strike again, like they did with your mother, like they did with Clara." No words were needed. The fear wasn't in the threat. It was in how quickly, how precisely it had come. What they held wasn't just a will. It was a lifeline that led straight to the heart of the darkness swallowing this town. Outside the window, in the grey drizzle behind the building, a man in a baseball cap stood motionless. He scribbled something in a leather notebook, then pulled out a phone. Phase 2 is underway. Mira's switched sides. They're reopening the past. St. Jude Church had just let out. Footsteps echoed down the stone hallway. In the sacristy behind the altar, Gregory sat alone, removing the heavy vestments. His expression was pensive, eyes darkening as a loyal parishioner. Celia, his close assistant, entered the room. "You were right," she said. "Mira's made contact with the boy." Gregory's hand tightened slightly around the armrest of his chair. "Who else knows?" "I'm not sure, but I think Hilda may be involved too. And a tape has surfaced." Gregory closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. The look in his eyes was no longer that of a solemn priest, but of a man who held absolute control. He'd suspected something all along, from Mira's late-night returns, her uneasy glances toward the statue, especially the day Hilda asked to borrow records from the old archive. The children had whispered about a wooden box, and Harvin, discreet but observant, had seen Mira talking to Noah in the hallway behind the church. One thread had been pulled, and now the entire curtain was trembling. "Call them in," he said. "We need to retrieve it, before this false sense of justice finds a voice." Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Noah, Mira, and Mrs. Hilda sat around a small table in the storage room. A map of the town lay spread before them. On the table sat an old leather notebook that once belonged to Charles Wren, along with an audio tape. "If we can find the original will, with fingerprints or a signature, we might be able to overturn everything," Mira said, her eyes clear and focused. Noah frowned slightly, thinking, "But what if they've destroyed it? Or what if they get to it before we do?" Mira's brow furrowed slightly. She kept her eyes fixed on the map. "I once saw Gregory locking a large chest in the back storeroom behind the chancel, where the vestments are kept. He never lets anyone near it. But once, I was sent down to get candles, and I accidentally opened the wrong cabinet. I caught a glimpse of an old piece of paper with a red seal, the kind Charles Wren used on official documents. I didn't have time to read it, but I'm certain it was something they've been hiding." Noah's hands clenched. The original will could be in there, or maybe Gregory moved it to the basement when they overhauled the entire filing system. Mrs. Hilda added softly, "Then we must go, before it's too late." That night, the three of them moved quietly through the old cemetery next to the church. The night air was bitterly cold, and a light misting rain soaked the moss beneath their steps. A stone path led them to a rusted iron door, half hidden beneath a wall choked with ivy. Mira pulled out an old key, something her mother, Clara, had hidden in the lining of her last ceremonial dress before she passed. Mira took a deep breath and slipped the key into the lock. The door groaned open, with a sound like breath escaping from a long-buried past. Inside, the air was thick with dampness. Mold, decaying paper, and rotting wood overwhelmed their senses. The beam of a flashlight swept over rows of dusty filing cabinets, grainy black and white photos mottled with age. In a drawer deep on the left side, they found a heavy leather envelope, sealed with red wax. In firm handwriting across the front, "To be delivered to the sole heir, Noah Wren." Noah froze. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was the original will, complete with Charles Wren's fingerprint and signature. The document confirmed it. Noah was his only living grandchild and the rightful heir to St. Jude Church and all associated holdings. Mrs. Hilda whispered, barely containing her emotion. This is undeniable proof." A sudden click, cold and sharp, echoed from the far end of the chamber. They turned. A figure stood motionless in the faint light from the hallway. His face was shadowed, but his eyes were piercing and cold. "Put the envelope down. Turn around. No talking." The man raised a pistol. Mira stepped in front of Noah, unwavering. Mrs. Hilda backed away, her hands shaking. Noah held the envelope tight. He didn't move. "We're not afraid," of you." Mira's voice rang out, steadier now. "I know who you are. Thomas, the former priest, you resigned when Gregory took power. Why come back now as a threat to justice? If there's any part of you that still has a conscience, tell the truth." The man was silent for a long moment. Then he slowly lowered the gun. The flashlight beam caught his face, aged, worn, unmistakably Thomas. His voice was low but firm. "I'm not here to hurt you, but I know what they're capable of, and how far they'll go to erase everything. I've kept my distance, hoping not to make things worse. But when I saw the three of you enter this place tonight, I knew. You've discovered what I thought only I knew. They're coming, and they'll kill if they have to protect the lie. Take the will to Ethan, the reporter. Tonight, he's the only one left with a platform they haven't silenced." A car horn blared in the distance, getting closer by the second. "Go. I'll hold them off. Now!" They burst from the crypt into the rain. Mira gripped Noah's hand, clutching the will and the wooden box. Mrs. Hilda followed behind. All of them headed toward Ethan, the one person who might still let the truth be heard. And in the darkness behind them, Thomas stepped back into the crypt. The gun in his hand did not waver, because he knew if this didn't end tonight, no one would live to tell the story. The next morning, the town woke up to a different kind of air. News had spread like wind, sweeping down the narrow streets. Something big had just been uncovered. It all began with the night journey of Noah, Mira, and Mrs. Hilda. The thing they brought back from the old church basement had now gone far beyond the three of them. On the front page of the local paper, the Morning Herald, the headline took up the entire space. That same evening, an emergency meeting was held at the parish hall. Father Gregory stood on the raised platform, flanked by 3 parish council members and Mrs. Celia, head of the lay ministry. Under the cold yellow light, he solemnly declared, "Brothers and sisters, what we are witnessing is a well-orchestrated smear campaign designed to destroy this community's faith." He raised a printed section of the article high above his head, voice ringing. "The so-called will they uncovered holds no legal weight, has no witnesses, and most suspicious of all, it turned up after a night of unlawful trespassing." Some in the pews nodded, but many remained silent. Mira and Noah sat near the back, alongside Mrs. Hilda and journalist Ethan. They knew Gregory wouldn't let the truth come out without a fight. Ethan stood up, microphone in hand. "If this is a fabrication, then why not allow an independent investigation to verify the signatures and fingerprints? And if it's a conspiracy, what would be the purpose, if not to restore the church to its rightful course?" Gregory didn't respond immediately. He scanned the room, then spoke coldly. "Truth doesn't come from trespassers and mysterious pieces of paper. Truth comes from tradition, from faith tested through time." That night, no one slept soundly. Gregory's fierce rebuttal made one thing clear. He didn't just plan to deny, it was a signal of counterattack. They all knew the recording was the strongest blow. It wasn't just paper that could be dismissed. It was a voice that couldn't be denied. Noah carefully locked the original will in a steel cabinet in Mrs. Hilda's room. They weren't taking chances with copies, not after the stranger in the cemetery, and Thomas's warning still lingered in their minds. Around 3 a.m., a soft noise came from the back storage area. The door creaked open. Not a single footstep was heard. By the time Noah woke up, the cabinet had been pried open. The recording, the direct piece of evidence against Gregory, was gone. By early morning, word of the break-in had spread quickly. What shocked the three of them most was the intruder's precision. No forced entry at the front, no muddy footprints, just a slightly ajar storage door in the back. as if the person knew exactly how to move within the old orphanage. It raised suspicions that this was no ordinary burglary. It felt deliberate, done by someone who knew both the layout and their routines. Ethan suggested calling the police, but Mrs. Hilda stopped him. If we report this now, we won't just lose the tape. We'll be handing them the reins to steer the entire investigation. Mira clenched her jaw. Someone had to know there's a way in that isn't the front gate. Only someone from the old system would know that. All three turned their eyes toward a name none of them dared speak aloud. Harvin. That same afternoon, St. Jude Church remained open to pilgrims, but the atmosphere inside had shifted. Under the soft, muted light of the stained glass, whispers now seemed to dig deeper into the ancient stone walls. In the record room behind the sanctuary, Harvin sat, going over the ledger. His hand trembled slightly as he turned each page, the numbers now accusing him with silent precision. The door opened without warning. Mira stepped in, her gaze sharp as a needle. I know you have the key to the back storeroom. Last night, only someone on the inside could have gotten in without making a sound. Harvin looked up, trying to keep his expression calm. Are you accusing me? Number, I'm waiting for your confirmation. You're the only one who knows both routes, the maintenance door and the old hallway leading to the storage room. Harvin stood, closed the ledger, but didn't deny it. He exhaled deeply. I didn't take the tape, but I know who did, and I know why. A church bell tolled in the middle of the day, each chime stretching out as if to wake something long asleep in the dark. At a small tea shop just outside the church, Harvin told Mira, and later Noah, Hilda, and Ethan, part of the truth. That years ago, Gregory had discovered the original will, and instead of making it public, he devised a plan to destroy the evidence, aiming to seize control and wealth from the parish. Harvin, serving as secretary, had been ordered to cover the tracks, but guilt had kept him from erasing everything. I didn't take the tape, but I know exactly what Gregory's up to. He thinks if he can wipe the audio clean, no one will be able to challenge his word. But what Mrs. Celia took? No one looked surprised. Noah asked in a low voice. It was a fake. I've seen the original, the casing, the recording marks. Everything's different. I think she grabbed the wrong one. Or maybe you kids had another plan. Mira and Ethan exchanged a quiet glance, then nodded. They had prepared for this. The tape Celia stole was a planted copy, left in an easily accessible drawer. The real one, along with backup footage from the storeroom's CCTV, had already been secured elsewhere. The entire theft had been anticipated. Mrs. Hilda let out a breath. If Gregory believes the evidence is gone, he'll lower his guard. Mira nodded, eyes catching the light. Then it's time to bring out the real one, before he has a chance to feel victorious. If she has the tape, we need a way to make it surface, publicly. Mira gave a faint smile, but there was a chill behind it. Then we force them to play their own game, where everyone can see, and no one dares hide behind a mask. The sky over St. Jude was gloomier than usual. The clouds hung heavy, as if holding back unspoken words. People had begun gathering in the churchyard. Today was the community Thanksgiving service, the biggest annual event hosted by the church. Gregory appeared in a white liturgical robe embroidered with gold thread, his face solemn like a saint entrusted with preserving tradition. Beside him walked Mrs. Celia, smiling constantly and shaking hands with parishioners as if recent events were nothing more than passing wind. In the room behind the church, Mira, Noah, Mrs. Hilda, and Ethan sat huddled around a handheld video player. They were doing one final check of the original tape, a voice recording of Gregory from years ago, where he spoke openly about misappropriating charity funds and how to get rid of anyone who didn't fall in line. No one has to die, But if someone like Amelia is too persistent, then the Lord has his ways. Noah clenched his fists, eyes fixed on the screen. Mrs. Hilda placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. This isn't just about you anymore. This is a voice for everyone who was ever forced into silence. The churchyard was full. The choir began singing, and the scent of candles and lilies drifted in the breeze. Mira and Ethan had set up a projection screen behind the pulpit. A group of student volunteers from the local high school were in charge of sound and technical equipment. They had already heard the recording. As Gregory stepped up to the pulpit to begin his speech, Mira stood quietly in the crowd, remote in hand. Mrs. Celia looked around, seeming to sense something amiss, but it was already too late. Ethan activated the sound system. The crowd noise faded into silence, replaced by the rustle of the screen being lowered. The first frame appeared. CCTV footage from the previous night. A security camera in the storage room captured Mrs. Celia in a dark cloak, discreetly unlocking a cabinet at the orphanage. The next frame showed her holding a tape box, inspecting it, then quickly slipping it into her coat pocket. Moments later, Mira, pretending to be asleep, cracked an eye open, capturing Mrs. Celia's exit through the back door on her phone. You are about to hear the one recording he feared most. Gregory's voice on the tape rang out, clear and unmistakable. No one's going to remember the seamstress woman in that house at the foot of the hill. Not if we move fast. That charity fund? Just a tool. Send it through Devon's, have it cleaned, then split the rest the usual way. Another segment followed a few seconds later. She, Amelia, thinks she can come here demanding rights for that kid. She doesn't understand. This place was never hers. Or any poor soul's for that matter. A muffled gasp came from one of the pews. Gregory could no longer stay silent. He raised his hand, his voice sharp and firm. This tape could have been edited. You think cheap tricks like this can tear down a lifetime of service? I have the original right here. No one can change the truth. He pulled another cassette from his pocket and held it aloft like a final trump card. Mrs. Celia looked at him with eyes gleaming in confidence. Ethan gave Mira a subtle nod. Gregory inserted the tape into his handheld player and pressed play. Nothing came out. He pressed again. Only a soft hiss. Then silence. No voice. No words. Mrs. Celia frowned. Gregory's face turned red, then pale. He checked again. It was indeed a tape. But it was blank. Noah stood, calm and composed. We knew you'd try to grab it. That's why the only one you got was a blank. We kept the original. And backups too. Ethan stepped forward, holding a stack of documents. This is the untouched original recording, and here is a verified voice analysis report from an independent specialist. A kilensvenjolk eges het tz zazalek, match to your voice. A woman in the congregation stood up, her hand trembling as she held out an envelope. I used to handle the donation logs. I was forced out when I asked about the missing funds that year. I kept a copy of the records. They match what's on the tape. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The truth was now undeniable. Just then, from the back of the churchyard, a voice spoke. Not loud, but steady and clear. I can confirm. What you've just heard is true. My name is Thomas. I'm a former priest of this parish. All heads turned. A silver-haired man in a worn grey shirt stepped forward. His gaze was firm, but calm. He walked through the crowd, straight to the pulpit, carrying a weathered leather-bound notebook. I witnessed Gregory receive large sums from Devon's, a dealer in church supplies, and the man behind the shady financial operations Gregory used to launder donation money. I objected, and I was removed from the clergy, but I kept a handwritten copy of the parish council meeting minutes from that year, when Gregory proposed altering the financial books without proper authorization. This is that copy. Thomas raised the notebook high. Mira stepped forward and displayed a scanned image of it on the projector, It matched the original Ethan held. The atmosphere broke open. A former priest, who had left his post out of disillusionment, had delivered the final blow to the curtain of deception. "I've stayed silent too long. Today, I choose to stand with conscience." The murmuring swelled like a wave. A few parishioners stepped up, confronting Gregory directly. He remained silent. Mrs. Celia tried to deflect, but no one listened anymore. An elderly man from the front row, Mr. Barley, who had once donated his entire estate to the church, rose to his feet, his voice shaky but resolute. "I want to know where my wife and I's money went, and why someone like Amelia died without anyone caring." Gregory retreated into the church, but the crowd was no longer passive. Many followed, not out of curiosity but anger. He turned, face drained of color. But this time, no one listened to him speak. Evening settled over St. Jude like a layer of ash on grey stone roofs. Inside the orphanage, Noah sat by the window, still holding a copy of the will. Mrs. Hilda was brewing tea. Mira stepped in, carrying a thick folder, photocopies of the documents Harvin had turned over. "The court will hold a hearing next week." Noah looked out the window. The children were playing in the yard. None of them were afraid to come near him anymore. "I never thought I'd hear the truth out loud, but today, no one could stop it." 1 week after the unmasking ceremony, St. Jude felt like a cracked vessel, its first light slipping through the fracture. On the front page of the Morning Herald, a bold headline read, "Conspiracy in the Shadows, St. Jude Church Exposed." Beneath it was a photo of Gregory, lost in the crowd, his eyes vacant. Beside him stood Noah, the boy clutching a wooden box, dressed in simple ceremonial attire. Gregory was being held for investigation. Mrs. Celia had been removed from the parish council, a move that left many stunned. Devons, the businessman behind a string of shady dealings, had vanished overnight, leaving behind his old shop and a stack of unshredded documents. At Town Hall, the first public hearing convened. The small courtroom was packed with townspeople. The air was thick, almost unmoving. Noah sat in the front row, Mira and Mrs. Hilda on either side. Gregory entered without his vestments, looking noticeably older. No longer a priest, just a man worn thin. Yet his eyes still held the last flickers of pride. Judge Aiken began reading through the evidence. The original will signed by Charles Wren, a voice analysis confirming a 98.7% match, CCTV footage from the theft, and the testimonies of several witnesses. Gregory sat frozen. His lawyers tried to push back. They claimed the audio recording was fabricated, that he had been set up. But then Harvin stood, his voice tight with emotion, as he confessed to signing off on false withdrawals, to altering records under pressure from Gregory and Celia. "I thought I was keeping the church standing, but in truth, I was helping to bring it down." Next came Thomas. He stood straight, his voice low and steady. He spoke of undocumented internal meetings and of the day Gregory received cash from Devons following a fundraising event. He held up a handwritten record of that meeting, and then he said, "I stepped down from my position because I couldn't stand the stench of lies. But silence is a sin too. Today, I intend to make that right." The courtroom fell still. Then Ethan, the journalist who had followed the story from the beginning, asked permission to present newly received evidence. He handed a sealed tape to the court clerk. The label read, "Confession of Bernard." The judge allowed the tape to be played before the court. Bernard's voice, Noah's father, came through the speakers, heavy but resolute. "My name is Bernard, and this is my final confession. I was wrong to hide my relationship with Amelia, Noah's mother, because I feared losing the family I had. But the greater sin was allowing Gregory to exploit that fear to destroy an innocent woman. It was he who urged me to sign away my paternal rights, who spun the lie that Amelia was a stray woman of no standing. He needed to wipe Charles Wren's legacy clean to claim control, and that meant turning Charles's grandson, my son, into a nameless shadow. I was complicit in my silence, and I beg for redemption through this truth. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Gregory hung his head. The truth had finally surfaced, not just of stolen wealth and usurped authority, but of the deliberate defamation of a woman's honor, all to preserve a sanctified illusion. As Gregory was escorted out of the courtroom, he turned back. His gaze no longer burned with arrogance or contempt. What remained was fatigue and shame, the look of a man who, after decades of wearing a mask, was finally forced to face his real reflection. And when that look met Noah's, it held no power anymore. It was just a final glance. Before the iron door closed behind him, inside the courtroom, the soft creak of the door echoed long before silence returned. No applause, no sighs, not a single comment, only stillness, thick like early morning mist. Not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of reckoning. Every eye turned to the boy seated in the front row. No longer the child from the hill, no longer the outcast once driven from the church. He was now the one who stood up to speak for a generation forgotten. Judge Aiken set the documents before him, carefully smoothing each page as if handling relics, not mere paperwork. He looked up, his voice deep and clear. Based on the verified evidence, the testimonies before this court, and the relevant legal documents, this court hereby restores the legal identity and rightful inheritance of Noah Wren, direct grandson of Charles Wren, according to the original will. In the packed room, a small sound escaped, not a gasp or whisper, but a long-held breath, finally let go. Beneath the table, Mira grasped Noah's hand, her eyes misted but bright. Mrs. Hilda rested her hand gently on the boy's shoulder, silent tears sliding down eyes that had witnessed too many nameless injustices. Noah sat still. He didn't rise. He didn't bow in thanks. He just sat there, quiet, like the wooden box he had once carried across town. In his mind, there were no cheers, no congratulations, only the voice of his mother in a windstorm night, whispering once in his ear, "Don't be afraid of the light, Noah, even if you're only a small spark." And now, that small spark had grown bright enough to shine into a much darker place. Outside the courthouse, the sky held no sun, no rain. But the air felt different. On the sidewalk, once marked by wary glances, stood familiar faces. They brought no flowers, no banners, but they were there. And that, in itself, was something that had never happened before. They didn't come to forgive. They didn't come to apologize. They came because, for the first time, they had to admit they were wrong. Not to a child, but to someone who bore the name Wren. Someone named Noah. And that was the real beginning. Not of a title, but of justice. Not for a legacy, but for the memory of a mother who had once been buried in silence. 3 days after the trial, St. Jude Church reopened. There were no longer proud, resounding bells echoing through the air, only a single low chime, slow and solemn, ringing out in the damp chill of an autumn morning. For the first time in years, the townspeople returned, not for ceremony, but because of the invitation of a child. Noah stood on the stone steps before the nave of St. Jude. He wore no robes, no symbols of rank. Just a carefully laundered white shirt, its cuffs slightly frayed, and a pair of worn grey slacks. Beneath him, the cold stone floor. Above, the lofty vaulted ceiling flickered with candlelight. Beside him, Mira clutched a copied will. The paper yellowed with age, but every word still sharp in ink. Mrs. Hilda was hunched low, lighting a large candle placed at the center of the nave. The light spread gently, washing over her face like a prayer that needed no words. "Thank you all for coming," Noah began. His voice wasn't loud, but steady and clear. In the silence of the sanctuary, it carried to every person gathered below. "I'm not here to reclaim power, and I'm not here to make anyone bow. I just want to say one thing." He looked up. His eyes were bright, not with anger, but with the effort of holding himself together, speaking on behalf of someone who no longer had the chance. "My mother wasn't a bad person. She wasn't guilty for loving. She wasn't wrong for sacrificing. What she left behind wasn't money, wasn't a name. It was trust. It was hope. And those things deserve to be returned to their rightful place, not hidden, not erased, not twisted." Noah paused, as if listening, to see if, somewhere behind the stone walls, his mother might be able to hear. Then he stepped forward, his voice lower, but firm. "From today on, I will no longer stay silent when someone calls my mother by the wrong name." Her name was Amelia Wren. She was a seamstress. She was a good mother. And she was a woman wronged by an entire system, simply because she had no voice. A soft cough from the back pew. Then silence. No interruptions, no objections. Just heads slowly beginning to lower. Not in shame, but as if, for the first time, they were willing to listen. Mira gently placed the will on the wooden altar. Mrs. Hilda folded her hands in quiet reverence. And the candle's flame burned tall, not casting light onto the statue behind, but onto something real. A boy who wasn't demanding justice, only offering truth. Outside, the clouds began to part. Through the high stained glass windows, the first ray of morning light crept across the church floor. As if, at last, the things thought to be lost could still be kindled, if someone was brave enough to name them. Mira quietly handed him a wooden box. He opened it. Inside was the old notebook of Charles Wren, Noah's grandfather. He turned to the first page and read aloud, in clear handwriting, "A church is not a place that holds power. It is a place that heals the impossible. If ever faith is distorted, begin again with the smallest truth." The entire sanctuary fell silent. Then, from the last pew, a woman stood. It was Mrs. Lorna, once the keeper of the old donation records. She placed a hand over her heart and bowed deeply. "We were wrong, but if you'll let us, we'd like to make it right." One by one, others stepped forward. No one spoke much. They simply placed a candle or a small flower. Mira, Mrs. Hilda, and the group of orphans stood on either side, welcoming them. St. Jude, the patron of lost causes, was now lit by those who once turned away. That evening, a small ceremony was held in the nave. In the presence of town hall officials and the community, Mira stepped forward to read Charles Wren's original will. One final time, openly and clearly. Noah's identity was affirmed, the legal grandson, the sole heir, as stated in the notarized document. When asked if he wished to assume the legal role of parish leader, Noah was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm still just a child. I'm not old enough to know how to care for a place like this, but someone once stepped down because he knew he wasn't doing right. And now, he's come back. Not to rule, but to make amends. I'd like to invite Mr. Thomas to take on the role of guardian of St. Jude in my place." The room froze. Thomas rose, eyes reddened. He said nothing, just bowed his head to Noah. And in that silence was the deepest kind of acceptance. Mira would stay, supporting Thomas in reopening the church's classrooms, shelter, and community kitchen, just as Charles once wished. As for Noah, after the ceremony, he chose to return to the orphanage with Mrs. Hilda. Though recognized as the legal heir to the Wren family and the church, His eyes still carried a quiet caution. He understood that true leadership wasn't about titles, but about a maturity he hadn't yet earned. To many, his choice seemed hard to understand, but for Noah, it was the only path that made sense. When he stepped out of City Hall that day, his gaze wasn't radiant. It was still. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew he wasn't ready. The title of heir was something others had placed on him. In his heart, he was still the 8-year-old boy, once cast out of the church under cold stares. He knew that to truly lead, it would take more than a name or a bloodline. It would take growth. And that, he was still learning. To Noah, the orphanage was more than shelter. It was the only place that never asked him to explain why he existed. No one there asked whose son he was or what he owed to prove his worth. There was the small dinner table each night, the sound of children's feet pounding through the yard, the warm glow of yellow light spilling through the window at dusk. And Mrs. Hilda, who never asked, just held his hand when he needed it. It was the only place he had ever been allowed to simply be himself. He didn't return out of fear, but because he understood, if he was to be worthy of the legacy left to him, he had to begin from the first place he ever learned what kindness meant. Before he left, he turned back to look at St. Jude one last time. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, only the gentle light through the stained glass resting softly on his hair. The door of the church, and of the truth, had opened again, not for one person, but for everyone. It didn't swing open with grandeur or fanfare, but with a quiet creak, like a memory long buried finding its way back into the light. The heavy oak doors, once shut tight under the weight of secrets and silence, now stood ajar, letting in the golden spill of late afternoon sun. Dust floated through the light, like tiny reminders of all that had once been hidden here, grief, guilt, and unanswered questions. But now, it wasn't just a building that welcomed people in. It was a space reclaimed. The silence that once hung over its pews had been broken, not by shouting or condemnation, but by the soft sound of truth being told, piece by piece, heart by heart. It was no longer a place held hostage by the past, no longer a monument to fear or shame. The door had opened not for a single soul brave enough to knock, but for everyone, the forgotten, the uncertain, the broken-hearted, the skeptical, for those who had stayed away for years, for those who had whispered doubts, for those who had loved in secret or lost in silence. It welcomed the children whose questions had gone unanswered, the elders who remembered things no one asked about, the mothers who carried burdens they never named. It welcomed the guilty who had changed, and the innocent who had waited too long for someone to believe them. In opening, the door didn't erase what had happened. It didn't pretend nothing had gone wrong, but it offered something just as powerful, a beginning, a chance to walk in, not as strangers or sinners, but as people, each with their own truth, each with a place at the table. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the church was no longer guarding something. It was giving something back. The news about the incident at St. Jude's Church hadn't died down. Stories were spun, then debunked, told again, then challenged. They slipped into street corners, whispered in small cafes, and lingered in the hallways of the local hospital. Though the church lights were on again, the shadow that once enveloped the place had left a faint scar in the hearts of the townspeople. Noah returned to the orphanage with a small suitcase and the familiar wooden box. In the first few days after the ceremony that exposed the truth, he kept a low profile. Not out of fear, but because he didn't know how to face the praise, the pity, or the admiration. All of it felt foreign. But the kids at the orphanage didn't let him hide for long. Elijah, the same boy who used to tease Noah, was the first to drag him out to the playground, shove an old soccer ball into his hands, and say matter-of-factly, "If you're the heir or whatever, Just kick like a normal person." Noah laughed, a light, genuine laugh. It was in that moment he realized, sometimes kindness doesn't need an apology. It just needs someone who doesn't change how they treat you after learning who you are. In the evenings that followed, Noah would walk around the orphanage grounds with Miss Hilda. They didn't talk much. Every now and then, she'd ask him about what had happened in the church, about Thomas, about Mira. Noah would answer slowly, pausing sometimes to watch the moon glimmer through the trees. Meanwhile, Mira stayed at the church. She began organizing the storage rooms, reopened old classrooms, and with Thomas, held reading sessions for underprivileged children. They didn't call it a charity. They called it Afternoons of Openness. One day, Thomas video called Noah. He was sitting in his small office, the restored painting of Charles Wren hanging behind him. He said, "Someone came looking for you. An older woman from the next town over. She said she used to be your mother's close friend when they were young." Noah paused. He'd never heard of his mother having any friends. When he met the woman the next day, she spoke of the years Amelia spent learning to sew, of the letters she sent that were never answered after Amelia left town. "She was smart," the woman said, "but she never thought she deserved to be loved. Maybe that's why, when she was betrayed, she didn't blame the man. She blamed herself." Noah didn't say anything, but when he walked her to the gate, his hand resting on the iron bars, he stopped and said, "I won't let anyone forget my mother's name. Even if they don't remember, I'll remind them." After that day, Noah began to write. At first, just short stories. Then he and Elijah started a small bulletin at the orphanage, retelling stories that had never been told, about people who quietly did the right thing, about those who had once made mistakes but tried to make them right, and sometimes about a woman named Amelia, who once lived at the foot of the hill. On the church balcony, Thomas and Mira stood side by side, looking down at the square where the children were playing. Doves landed on the slate roof, quietly, like peace just beginning to bloom after a long storm. One afternoon, Mira found an old leather-bound notebook in the archives, its pages yellowed and scattered with handwritten notes by Charles Wren. One line read, "If one day the truth is buried beneath layers of ritual and ambition, it will be the children, the souls still untainted, who will bring it back to light." Mira copied the quote and hung it above the entrance to the church's new library. She and Thomas didn't rebuild taller steeples or erect new statues. Instead, they opened literacy classes, a kitchen for the homeless, and a small reading corner. At the orphanage, Noah gradually returned to his routines, but every night, before falling asleep, he would place the wooden box at the head of his bed, a quiet reminder of what had happened and what must be preserved. One night, it rained. Wind howled through the cracks in the window, but he didn't feel cold. He just lay there, listening to the wind and thinking of his mother. He whispered, "I won't forget you, Mom. Even if they do, I'll remember enough for all of them." And somewhere, where no one knew the name of the place, in a small room filled with forgotten ledgers, a sealed envelope sat with a single line written across it, "For the next person, if they need to know what really happened." From the shadows, a gaze still watched, but this time it was to protect. Noah's story wasn't just a journey for justice. It was a gentle reminder that silence, at times, is a choice. But when we dare to speak, even from the smallest corner, light begins to spread. Dear friend, after all that's happened, what moved you the most? Was it the loneliness of a child, or the moment a community finally chose to stand with the truth? And if you're a woman, a mother, a sister, or someone who has carried too much in silence, are you doing okay? Was today especially tiring? If so, take a moment. Breathe deeply. You are not alone. Someone here wants to listen. If you're hearing this story in your car, maybe the road home feels quieter than usual tonight. Drive safe. In the rush of it all, sometimes all we really need is someone who understands, and a small silence to listen to our own heart.